In this chapter, we'll talk about type conversion. So what is type conversion? Let's do a quick example to understand what Python does behind the scenes to convert one variable type to another variable type. See, we have an example here. Let's copy these two variables, weight1 and weight2. So what's happening here is weight1 is 25 pounds or kilos, let's say, and weight2 is 25.5 kilos. Say we want to add weight1 and weight2 into another variable. Now, what type of variable is weight1? Weight_1 is an integer variable, right? So it's a whole number, 25. Weight_2 is a floating point variable because it has got that additional decimal here. You can quickly verify it by saying type weight_1. Execute. Oh, we didn't execute this first. Now execute this. So this is an integer, right? So what about the type of variable weight_2? This one is a float. Simple enough, right? Now what if we add weight1 with weight2? Weight equals weight_1 weight_2 and then execute. Now the result is what you'd expect, 50.5. 25 plus 25.5 would be 50.5. That's fair. What is the type of the variable weight? What do you expect? Should it be a float or should it be an int? This was an int and this was a float. So what should be the variable that combines both these values? Should it be a float or should it be an int? Well, that's a tough decision because let's say weight_1 is 25 and that's an integer. So this is weight_1 and weight_2 25.5 and this is a float. So when you combine both these things together, both these variables together, should the resultant variable be an int or a float? Now if you say it's an int, the result would be 50. If you say it's a float, the result will be 50.5. And the reason is simple. If you convert a float to an int, you lose the precision. So this thing over here, you lose. And that's the reason why 25 plus 25 becomes 50. But if you let it be float, you cannot add an int and a float together. You have to convert this to a float. In which case, this becomes 25.0. Right? And 25.0 plus 25.5 will be 50.5. What is the correct method? We don't want to lose data, right? So if we go with the first method, we lose information. So this is wrong. So the correct way to do it is to convert this int to a float and get the correct answer. So the resulting variable weight will also be a float. So this is wrong and this is right. And which method does Python follow? Of course it follows the correct method. It doesn't lose any information. When you add an integer and a floating point variable, the resulting variable will always be a float. Let's quickly check it. So weight equals weight1 plus weight2 and the type of weight will be a float, right? Okay, now that we understand what type conversion really is, there are two different types of type conversions that Python follows. The first one is called an implicit conversion, where Python does the conversion automatically. And the second type of conversion is called an explicit conversion, where we would have to do that conversion because Python doesn't know whether to convert or not. Let's see some examples. We have already seen an example of an implicit conversion. The example that we have seen previously, where we add an integer to a float. So this one was an integer. This one was a float. And when we added integer and float, Python automatically converted this to a float. So this is an example of an implicit conversion. Let's see another example of an implicit conversion. So say weight is 21.5 and we want to print the weight. So we say print weight equals comma weight. So print is a function that we can use to print something on the console on your command line. And when you say something separated by something, like this is a string and this in this case is a floating point. So all we are asking Python is to print these two things or variables together, like join them together. Now can a string and float be joined? No, it doesn't make sense, right? So what we want essentially is to say weight equals and then over here substitute this value, right? Now in this case all we are asking Python is to actually concatenate weight, this string, with this floating point. And when that is being done, this floating point is actually converted, type converted to a string. And this happens implicitly, meaning you don't have to specifically convert it to a string. It automatically does it for you. Here's another example. This is a complex number and this is an integer. What if you add an integer and a complex number, a plus b? The resulting value, resulting variable will also be a complex number. It will not be an integer, because if you try to convert this to an integer, you lose this part and you don't want to lose information. And Python actually does not lose information. So it upgrades the integer also to a complex number and adds them up. So these are all examples of implicit conversion. Now, like I said, implicit conversion does not always work. So here is an example. See, there are two variables, weight 1 and weight 2. Now what is this input function? Input and then followed by two parentheses. It's an inbuilt function in Python that gets user input. So the way we are programming this is we're asking the user to enter a value and that will be stored in weight 1. And similarly, enter another value and that will be stored in weight 2. Let's execute this and you'll understand. Execute. And this is weight 1. See, we are trying to give an input. Weight 1 is say 25, say kilos. Enter. And then weight 2 is 25.5 kilos. Okay, very good. Now, just like we have done before, weight equals weight underscore 1, weight underscore 2. Shift enter. Now, what do you expect the value of weight to be? Is it 50.5? Let's see. Shift enter. It's 25.5. What is that? Why did that happen? The reason is simple. Weight 1 was 25 and weight 2 was 25.5, and if we add them up either as integers or floating points, you get 50 or 50.5. But if you concatenate them, this is 25 and this is 25.5, and what is being done here is not actually addition, it's concatenation. And why did that happen? Why was this concatenation and not addition? Now, to understand this, let's do something. Let's check out what types are these variables, weight 1 and weight 2. Okay, what is the type weight underscore 1? Shift enter. It's not an integer, it's a string. Why? Because this function right here, input, gathers input from the user, right? Now, the way Python gathers this input is Python doesn't know if you're entering a number, if you're entering a string, if you're entering a floating point, if you're entering a complex number. It doesn't know. The reason is simple. When you enter 25, you know that it's a number, but how does Python know that it's a number? It could be a string as well, like 25 years. That's a string, right? Like so, 25 years. This is a string. When we are referring to the 25 here, it's not an integer. It's a string, 25 years, in double quotes or single quotes. So the way the input function works is input function always returns a string. Right? And that's what we have confirmed here. Wait1 is equal to input, and then we have entered 25 here, and that 25 was captured as a string. And strings in Python have a simple property. You can add strings together. For example, you can do something like this. There are two strings, say Ajay is one string and tech is another string. What if you add them up? Well, they're not numbers. How can you add strings? Well, Python has a property with strings. In fact, this is also a property with Java. In Java also you can add strings. And when you add strings, all Python does is it concatenates them. So the add operator with strings works like a concatenation. And that's the reason why you have 25, 25.5 when you add both these together. It's concatenating them as strings. So this is a case where Python is doing the right thing, but that's not what we want. So we want to add them up as numbers, not as strings. So how do you go about doing it? This is where explicit conversion comes in. Because wait1 is captured as a string, we want to convert it explicitly to an integer or a float in this case. So we are saying, so wait equals, we just don't want to add wait underscore 1 and wait underscore 2 the way that we have done it before. Instead, we want to convert them to integers. And the way we do that is by saying int of wait underscore 1 plus int of wait underscore 2. Shift enter. Does it work? No, it doesn't. Why? It says, look at this error. It says invalid literal for int with base 25.5. Look at this 25.5. Can you convert a floating point number or a string to an integer? Well, you might, but it results in a truncation, right? So it's saying it's not a valid way of converting it. So it doesn't want to convert a floating point number to an integer. That's basically the complaint. So instead of doing an int, do a float. Float. And then a float. Shift enter. This time it should work. And what would be the weight? Weight. Shift enter. 50.5. So 25.5 plus 25 is 50.5. Now we got the right answer. So this is an example of explicit type conversion. This is pretty straightforward, right? Sometimes type conversion that Python does by default does not work. And if you want to do the type conversion yourself, use explicit type conversion. And the way to do that is by casting it, or you can call it typecasting, which is actually a fancy word for converting a variable from one type to another. So you're actually casting a variable which is a string. So this one was a string before. Reason why it's a string is because this returns a string. And because this is a string, you're using explicit typecasting using the float function. And the result is that this gives you a float variable. And float plus float is another float. That's why you get a correct weight. Alright, so that was explicit type conversion.